Kara Shalom, welcome to our watercolor journey. This is an easy landscape painting where Heinrich used only 3 colors. The materials used are listed in the description below. On the palette we have Sepia, Cadmium Orange and Transparent Sienna. The Canson paper is taped to a flat board and Heinrich uses a Hwahong No. 1 Hake brush to wet the entire paper. He uses the same Hake brush to paint the sky area. For the sky, he uses Cadmium Orange. It's an opaque color, which means that it isn't as transparent as other watercolors, but by adding it to the wet background, it diffuses to a soft, powdery yellow. He uses the hake to spread the paint about 2/3 down. The top part of the sky is a bit darker to help create perspective. The bottom part is lighter as it fades into the distance. He uses the silver black velvet No. 8 round and all the colors on the palette to paint the first layer of the trees in the background. He's working wet on wet, so the paint disperses nicely into soft edges. The paint is slightly thicker than the consistency of the moisture on the paper, so it disperses, but it does not cause blooms. He uses the tip of the brush to lightly dab the paint in and then allows the terrain in the foreground. Then he adds a few more marks to add rocks and some bushes to the immediate foreground. These are usually darker as it is directly in the viewer's line of sight. The paint to settle a bit and then adds a few sprinkles of ordinary table salt to the bottom of the page. This will create some texture in the foreground. Allow the painting to dry naturally. A hairdryer will speed up the process, but it might influence the way the salt works. The painting is dried and the salt created beautiful marks in the foreground. Here he uses the silver black velvet No. 2 round to draw the trees in the background. He uses a watery mix of sepia for the trees and makes sure to work very lightly with the tip. At different heights and in different sizes to help with perspective. He uses the belly of the brush and transparent sienna to paint the first layer of the foliage. He uses a bit of water to spread the paint. The more paint you have on your brush, the more solid the foliage will appear. If you use less paint, you can get a lovely dry brush or scumbling effect, which resemble loose leaves. Try to vary the amount of paint you pick up to help get some variation in the foliage. If all of it is painted in solid color, you will lose the natural effect. These trees are painted wet on dry, so the trunks, branches and foliage tend to create hard outlines in contrast to the soft lines of the background. The hard edges push the trees more forward, so that also helps to create depth in your painting. He uses all the colors on the palette to create variation in the foliage. He also drew a thin line underneath the trees to ground them. Without such a line, the trees might look like they are floating in thin air. He makes a bit stronger mix of sepia and uses that to add more bushes to the base of the trees and to fill out the terrain. The slightly thicker mix makes the dry brushing a lot easier to achieve. He does the same thing to the trees on the left. Notice that the trees become smaller toward the middle of the painting. This creates perspective. The smaller foliage in the trees to fill them out a bit more and to create more contrast between the different values. He has light, middle and dark values in the foliage, which also helps to give them a more three-dimensional look. He adds a touch of cadmium yellow to bring some light into the foliage. He adds some more dark lines to define the terrain and then uses water to soften the lines into the surrounding area. By using diagonal lines, he gives variation to the layout of the terrain. It creates a small valley between the two groups of trees, and this also helps to lead the viewer's eye into the painting. He uses darker or stronger paint for these as they are closer to the viewer. He also uses the darker paint to define the contours of the terrain a bit more. and he uses the salt patches to guide him with the details. He uses the silver black velvet number 2 round and some cadmium yellow to dry brush a few patches of foliage into the saplings in the front. The warmer yellow also helps to bring these objects a little bit more forward. He uses the same small brush to add a few splatters of color to the foreground. This helps to create texture. A small brush will generally give you small concentrated spots, where a bigger brush will give you larger, more dispersed dots. It's always a good idea to shield the areas that you don't want to splatter with a paper towel. Splatters can be very unpredictable at times. He adds one more layer to the foliage in the background and then adds some shadow lines to define the trees a bit more. This is really a very easy way of practicing various brush strokes and enhancement techniques like using salt or dry brushing and splattering. He uses clean water to soften some of the splatters to give a bit more definition to the terrain. Leave us a comment if you have used opaque colors in your paintings and tell us what you think of them. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And thank you so much for watching. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Vaya con Dios.